In the Middle Ages, Europe was reborn from the ruins of Rome. A world of kings and nobles, monks and merchants, warriors and peasants took shape. It was a civilization of contrasts, faith and doubt, glory and misery, order and chaos. Over the course of 1,000 years, these forces carved out the foundations of the modern world. To understand this vast story, we must begin with the Roman Empire. For centuries, the empire had ruled the Mediterranean, enforcing stability through legions, law, and advanced infrastructure. Roman roads and aqueducts, bustling cities, and a shared system of government tied together peoples from Britain to Egypt. This period, remembered as the Pax Romana, was one of prosperity and relative peace. But deep within the empire, change was brewing. In the eastern provinces, a new faith was born, Christianity. It began as a small, persecuted sect of Judaism, but over the centuries, it spread through trade routes and missionary work, capturing the hearts of ordinary people. By the 4th century, emperors themselves converted, transforming it into the official religion of the empire. Yet, as Christianity rose, Rome itself faltered. The once great state was plagued by economic crisis, political instability, and waves of invaders pressing against its long frontiers. In 395, the empire was permanently split into two: a wealthy, urban, and resilient east centered on Constantinople, and a fragile, rural, and declining west ruled from Rome and later Ravenna. In the west, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, and many others were drawn into Roman lands, sometimes as allies, sometimes as conquerors. Their migrations reshaped the political map. Rome's armies could no longer hold them back, and in 476, a Germanic leader named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. This event is often used as the marker of the end of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages. For many centuries, historians labeled the following era as the Dark Ages, imagining a time of collapse and ignorance. Yet in truth, this was not merely decline, but transformation. Rome, Christianity, and the so-called barbarian peoples blended together, creating something entirely new: medieval Europe. By the dawn of the 6th century, the map of Europe had been redrawn. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but in its place stood a patchwork of new kingdoms ruled by Germanic leaders. These rulers, once called barbarians by the Romans, were now kings in their own right, claiming legitimacy through a blend of Roman traditions and their own warrior customs. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy, the Visigoths dominated Spain, and the Franks established themselves in Gaul, the land that would later be called France. Other groups, such as the Burgundians, Vandals, and Lombards, carved out their own realms. These were fragile states, often little more than loose alliances of warriors led by charismatic kings. For ordinary people, life was very different than it had been in the Roman age. Cities had shrunk or fallen into ruin, their populations fleeing to the countryside. The great networks of Roman trade collapsed. With coinage scarce, barter became the norm. Roads decayed, communication slowed, and long-distance exchange dwindled. Without professional armies, kingdoms relied on the loyalty of warriors bound by personal oaths rather than centralized command. Literacy fell drastically. Very few outside the clergy could read or write, and knowledge that had once flourished in Roman libraries was now preserved only in isolated monasteries. Yet these were not only years of hardship. Christianity, which had been spreading for centuries, now became the glue binding these diverse societies together. Kings and their nobles converted, often encouraged by bishops and monks who offered literacy, diplomacy, and the prestige of Rome's ancient faith. The church gave legitimacy to new rulers, while rulers protected the church in return. The fusion of Germanic traditions, Roman legacy, and Christian belief was slowly giving birth to medieval Europe. Still, compared to the rich, urban Byzantine Empire in the east, or the powerful Islamic Caliphate that would soon rise in the south and sweep across North Africa, the kingdoms of Western Europe seemed weak, fragmented, and impoverished. They lacked infrastructure, strong economies, or centralized bureaucracies. But the seeds had been planted, and in time they would grow into something far stronger.
For now, Europe remained a world of fragile kingdoms, small communities, and uncertain futures. But a new power was about to emerge, one that would revive the dream of empire in the West. In the 8th century, the balance of power in Western Europe began to shift. Among the many Germanic kingdoms, one rose above the rest: the Franks. Their realm, centered in what is now France and Western Germany, would become the cradle of a new imperial experiment. At first, the Franks were one kingdom among many, ruled by the Merovingian dynasty. But real power slipped into the hands of their chief officials, the mayors of the palace. One of these mayors, Charles Martel, the Hammer, cemented his reputation in 732 at the Battle of Tours. There, Frankish warriors halted the advance of Muslim armies pushing north from Spain. Though Muslim power remained strong in Iberia, the battle became a symbol of Christian defense and Frankish might. Charles' descendants, the Carolingians, soon claimed the throne outright. His son, Pepin the Short, deposed the last Merovingian king and had himself anointed as ruler. By allying closely with the Pope, he secured legitimacy that no other ruler in the West could claim. In gratitude, Pepin granted the Pope lands in Italy, laying the foundation of the Papal States. But it was Pepin's son, Charlemagne, who would change the face of Europe. When he became king in 768, he launched decades of conquests that expanded his realm into an empire spanning much of Western and Central Europe. He subdued the Lombards in Italy, crushed the Saxons in brutal campaigns, and pushed his borders deep into Central Europe. Charlemagne was not only a conqueror, but also a builder. He patronized learning, gathering scholars from across Europe at his court in Aachen. Monasteries were encouraged to copy ancient texts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have vanished forever. His reforms in law, administration, and coinage sought to bring order to his vast lands. Under his reign, culture experienced what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and religious devotion inspired by Rome. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne reached the peak of his power. In Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the West had an emperor. This was more than ceremony. It symbolized a vision of a unified Christian Europe ruled by a sacred bond between church and crown. The Carolingian Empire did not last long after Charlemagne's death in 814. His heirs quarreled, and the vast realm was divided in the Treaty of Verdun of 843. Yet the legacy endured. The dream of empire, the fusion of church and state, the revival of learning, and the idea of a Christian West bound together by shared culture, these became cornerstones of medieval Europe. But even as these ideas spread, the empire itself fractured. Local lords grew stronger, kings weaker, and Europe once again faced waves of devastating invasions. After Charlemagne's death, the empire he built quickly unraveled. His grandsons divided it into competing realms, and the dream of a strong, united West collapsed into civil war and fragmentation. As rulers quarreled, external enemies closed in. Europe entered one of the most turbulent centuries in its history. From the north came the Vikings. Fierce seafarers from Scandinavia, they launched swift raids on coastal towns, monasteries, and cities. Their longships could travel up rivers, striking deep inland with terrifying speed. Paris, London, and countless other settlements fell victim to their attacks. To terrified villagers, the words, "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord," became a desperate prayer. Yet the Vikings were more than raiders. They were also traders and settlers. In time, they established permanent colonies in places like Ireland, England, Normandy, and even as far as Iceland and Greenland. From the east came the Magyars, nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes. They swept across Central Europe in lightning-fast raids, plundering towns and villages. Their cavalry seemed unstoppable until 955, when the German king Otto I defeated them at the Battle of Lechfeld. This victory ended their raids, and the Magyars eventually settled, adopting Christianity and founding the Kingdom of Hungary. From the south came Muslim raiders and pirates, striking across the Mediterranean. They attacked Sicily, Sardinia, southern Italy, and the coasts of Provence and Spain. Some settlements were destroyed entirely, while others were forced to pay tribute for protection. The Mediterranean, once Rome's secure highway of trade, became a dangerous frontier. These waves of invasions shattered the fragile order left by the Carolingians. Kings proved unable to defend their lands, and the people turned instead to local nobles for protection. Across Europe, castles rose from the landscape, wooden fortresses at first, later rebuilt in stone. From these strongholds, lords ruled over peasants in their surrounding territories.
This system of land, loyalty, and protection became known as feudalism. In a world where centralized states had collapsed, feudalism was the framework that allowed society to survive. A lord granted land, called a fief, to his vassal in exchange for military service. Peasants, bound to the land, provided food and labor, while knights offered armed defense. At its core, medieval society became a web of personal relationships, oaths sworn, duties exchanged, obligations enforced. Kings themselves were often little more than the most powerful lords in this chain, dependent on the loyalty of their vassals. Power was fragmented, local, and precarious. Yet, even within this chaos, new structures of stability were forming. By the 10th century, the great invasions began to fade. Vikings settled in Normandy and converted to Christianity. The Magyars established their own Christian kingdom. Muslim power in southern Europe was contained by resurgent Christian rulers. With peace slowly returning, Europe was ready to grow again, socially, economically, and culturally. Around the year 1000, the tide began to turn. After centuries of invasions, political fragmentation, and economic stagnation, Europe entered a new era of stability and growth. This transformation was gradual, but its impact was immense. One of the most important changes was in agriculture. For centuries, medieval peasants had struggled with poor harvests and limited technology. But now, innovations such as the heavy plow, the horse collar, and the widespread use of the three-field system revolutionized farming. The heavy plow allowed farmers to break the dense soils of northern Europe, opening vast new lands for cultivation. The horse collar made it possible for horses, faster and stronger than oxen, to pull plows and carts efficiently. And the three-field rotation increased yields by alternating crops and leaving only a portion of the land fallow each year. The result was a dramatic rise in food production. Populations grew, villages expanded, and forests were cleared to make way for fields. New settlements appeared across Europe, from Spain to Poland. With more food available, famine was less frequent, and communities became healthier and more resilient. This agricultural revolution fueled economic revival. Surpluses of grain and goods encouraged trade, which in turn led to the rebirth of towns and cities. Markets and fairs flourished, connecting local producers with merchants from across Europe and beyond. Over time, many towns won charters, granting them independence from feudal lords. A new class of townspeople, merchants, artisans, and craftsmen, emerged, reshaping medieval society. Nowhere was this urban revival more visible than in Italy, where cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Florence became hubs of Mediterranean trade. Merchants there connected Europe with the riches of the Islamic world and Byzantium, importing spices, silks, and knowledge. In Northern Europe, towns along the North and Baltic Seas formed the Hanseatic League, a powerful trading network that spanned thousands of miles. The cultural consequences of this growth were equally profound. As wealth increased, so did the desire for learning. Monasteries and cathedral schools became centers of education, and the first universities were founded in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Latin remained the language of scholarship, but new vernacular literatures began to flourish, from the chanson de geste in France to the epic tales of Scandinavia. Art and architecture blossomed as well. Romanesque churches, with their heavy stone walls and rounded arches, gave way in the 12th century to the soaring Gothic cathedrals, filled with stained glass and light. These monumental buildings, rising above crowded towns, testified not only to faith, but also to growing technical skill and collective ambition. By the High Middle Ages, Europe was no longer a weak, fragmented land. It was becoming dynamic, outward-looking, and ambitious. Expansion was on the horizon, both within Europe and far beyond it. The centuries after the year 1000 were not only a time of growth in fields and markets, they were also a time of awakening in minds and spirits. What had once seemed like a fractured, struggling civilization began to shine with confidence, producing a cultural renaissance that set Europe apart. At the heart of this transformation was the Church. Monasteries had long been islands of stability, where monks copied texts and preserved knowledge. But now, their influence expanded. Great abbeys such as Cluny in France became centers of reform, discipline, and artistic patronage. Monastic orders multiplied: the Benedictines, the Cistercians, and later the mendicant orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans. Each brought new energy to the spiritual and intellectual life of Europe.
Learning spread beyond monasteries into cathedral schools, which evolved into Europe's first universities. Bologna specialized in law, Paris in theology, Oxford and Cambridge in a mix of disciplines. These institutions gathered scholars from across Europe, creating a community of learning that transcended local boundaries. They debated philosophy, natural science, and medicine, often relying on texts newly translated from Arabic and Greek. Through contact with the Islamic world and Byzantium, Europe rediscovered Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid, authors long forgotten in the West. This intellectual revival gave birth to scholasticism, a method of inquiry that sought to harmonize faith and reason. Thinkers such as Anselm of Canterbury and later Thomas Aquinas argued that human logic could support divine truth. While modern readers may find their debates abstract, scholasticism established a foundation for systematic thought and critical argument that shaped European education for centuries. Meanwhile, literature in the vernacular blossomed. In France, troubadours sang of courtly love, shaping ideals of romance that still echo today. Epic poems such as the Song of Roland celebrated loyalty and Christian heroism. In Germany, the Nibelungenlied wove together myth and chivalric ideals. In England, storytellers began crafting works in Middle English, laying the groundwork for Chaucer's later masterpieces. Across Europe, storytelling was no longer confined to Latin scholars. It became a living art shared by nobles, townsfolk, and peasants alike. Architecture was the most visible sign of this cultural flowering. The Romanesque style, with its heavy stone walls, round arches, and fortress-like solidity, gradually gave way to something new, the Gothic cathedral. First seen in France, this style used pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses to lift buildings to unprecedented heights. Walls dissolved into stained glass windows, flooding interiors with light and color. Chartres, Notre Dame, and Reims became marvels of engineering and symbols of collective faith. To medieval eyes, these soaring cathedrals were glimpses of heaven made stone. Music, too, advanced. Plain chant evolved into polyphony, as choirs experimented with harmonies and complex rhythms. These innovations, born in church choirs, would eventually pave the way for Europe's rich musical tradition. Taken together, these developments show a society no longer content to merely survive. Medieval Europe was becoming ambitious, self-confident, and creative. Faith inspired its culture, but curiosity fueled its learning. Tradition grounded it, but innovation pushed it forward. By the 12th century, Europe was not only holding its own against the great civilizations of Byzantium and Islam, it was beginning to surpass them in certain fields. But Europe's ambitions were not confined to the classroom or the cathedral. The same energy that built soaring towers and crafted epic poetry also fueled expansion beyond its borders. Knights, nobles, and kings would soon turn their gaze outward, seeking conquest, colonization, and holy war. By the 11th century, Europe's growing strength no longer stayed contained within its borders. The same forces that fueled agricultural expansion, urban revival, and cultural growth also pushed Europeans outward to conquer new lands, establish new kingdoms, and reshape the balance of power in the wider world. One of the earliest examples of this expansion was the Norman adventure. The Normans began as Viking settlers in northern France, but within a few generations they had transformed into one of the most dynamic warrior elites in Europe. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest of England reshaped not only the politics of the island, but also its culture, language, and aristocracy. French-speaking Norman lords fused with Anglo-Saxon traditions, laying the foundations of medieval England. The Normans did not stop there. Adventurers from Normandy and southern Italy pushed into Sicily, driving out Muslim rulers and creating a multicultural kingdom that blended Latin, Greek, and Arab influences. Norman kites even joined expeditions into the eastern Mediterranean, leaving their mark on the Crusader states. Meanwhile, across the Iberian Peninsula, the centuries-long struggle known as the Reconquista gained momentum. Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile, Aragon, Leon, and Portugal, gradually expanded southward against Muslim Al-Andalus. This was not a single continuous war, but rather a series of campaigns, truces, and shifting alliances. Yet by the 12th century, Christian advances were accelerating. The Reconquista was fueled not only by political ambition, but also by religious zeal, as victories were celebrated as triumphs of Christianity over Islam.
The greatest outward thrust of medieval Europe, however, came with the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II called on Western knights to aid their Byzantine brethren and to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. His fiery sermon at Clermont unleashed a wave of enthusiasm that swept across Europe. Nobles, peasants, monks, and merchants all took the cross, inspired by promises of spiritual reward and worldly adventure. The First Crusade shocked the Islamic world. Against overwhelming odds, Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, establishing a series of fragile states in the Levant: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
For nearly 2 centuries, these Crusader states survived, sustained by waves of reinforcements, Italian merchants, and papal support. The Crusades were not limited to the Holy Land. Crusading fervor spilled into Spain, the Baltic, and even against Christian heretics in Europe itself. The Teutonic Knights waged holy war in Prussia and Lithuania, while papal armies marched against the Cathars in southern France. Crusading became both a religious duty and a political tool. Yet the consequences of these expansions went far beyond the battlefield. Contact with the Islamic world and Byzantium brought Europeans into closer touch with advanced knowledge, trade networks, and luxury goods. Spices, silks, sugar, and new technologies flowed into Europe, feeding its economic and cultural growth. At the same time, the crusading ideal hardened religious boundaries, deepening divisions between Christianity, Islam, and even Judaism. By the 13th century, Europe had become a civilization on the move. It was expanding outward militarily, economically, and intellectually. Its cities hummed with trade, its cathedrals soared skyward, and its knights rode under the banner of the cross. The medieval world, once fragile and divided, was now vigorous and ambitious. But this energy carried risks. The very forces that propelled Europe upward, population growth, urbanization, religious zeal, would also lead to new tensions, conflicts, and crises. Ahead lay both triumphs and tragedies, the flowering of high medieval civilization and the shadow of famine, war, and plague. By the 13th century, medieval Europe stood at its height. What had once been a struggling, fragmented world now thrived with bustling cities, powerful monarchies, and a culture that radiated confidence. Historians often call this era the High Middle Ages, and for good reason. It was a time of balance between old traditions and new innovations, of stability mixed with bold ambition. Monarchies grew stronger. In France, the Capetian kings expanded their control, slowly building the centralized monarchy that would dominate later centuries. In England, the Plantagenets ruled over a realm that stretched across the Channel, though their power was tempered by the Magna Carta of 1215, which limited royal authority and laid early foundations for constitutional government. The Holy Roman Empire remained fragmented, but its emperors still wielded vast influence in Central Europe. Cities and commerce flourished. Venice, Genoa, and Florence became banking and trading powerhouses, linking Europe with the riches of the East. Flanders and northern Italy grew wealthy from textiles and crafts. The Hanseatic League dominated the North and Baltic Seas, creating a commercial empire of merchants that rivaled kings and princes. Markets and fairs drew traders from across the continent, and money, once rare, circulated widely. Banking families such as the Medicis in Florence pioneered financial innovations that would later fuel the Renaissance. Universities matured. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and others became magnets for scholars. Thomas Aquinas wove Aristotelian philosophy into Christian theology in his Summa Theologica, creating one of the greatest intellectual syntheses of the age. Meanwhile, Roger Bacon and other early thinkers pushed the boundaries of science, experimenting with optics, mathematics, and natural philosophy. Art and architecture soared. Gothic cathedrals reached their zenith. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Cologne rose higher and more intricate than ever before. Stained glass windows bathed worshippers in light, while sculpture and painting brought biblical stories to life for a largely illiterate population. Music advanced, with composers at Notre Dame in Paris developing polyphony that foreshadowed the harmonies of the Renaissance. Knighthood and chivalry flourished. The knight was no longer just a warrior, he was an ideal. Literature such as the Song of Roland and the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes exalted courage, loyalty, and devotion to ladies. Tournaments and jousts celebrated martial skill, while the code of chivalry tried, though often failed, to temper violence with honor. The Church reached the height of its power. Popes such as Innocent III claimed authority over kings and emperors, launching crusades not only to the Holy Land, but also within Europe. Monastic orders flourished, with the Franciscans preaching poverty and service, and the Dominicans pursuing education and the defense of orthodoxy. The Inquisition was established to root out heresy, showing both the strength and the severity of the Church at its peak. For ordinary people, life was still harsh by modern standards. Most were peasants tied to the land, vulnerable to famine and disease. Yet even they benefited from growing stability, more reliable harvests, and stronger community ties through village churches, guilds, and festivals. By 1300, Europe looked outward with confidence. Its population had doubled since the year 1000. Its cities rivaled those of the Islamic world. Its intellectual life was dynamic, its art breathtaking, its armies formidable. It was no longer a peripheral civilization, it was becoming a dominant force on the global stage. And yet, beneath this prosperity, cracks were forming. Population growth strained resources. Monarchs and popes clashed over power. Trade brought not only wealth, but also new risks. Within a century, this glittering civilization would be shaken to its core by famine, war, and the deadliest plague in human history. The brilliance of the High Middle Ages did not last. By the early 13th century, Europe's prosperity had reached its limits. Populations had grown beyond what the land could reliably support. Cities were crowded, and political rivalries simmered. When disaster struck, it came not as one blow, but as a chain of calamities that shook medieval society to its foundations. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, was the first shock. Years of unusually heavy rains ruined harvests across northern Europe. Crops rotted in the fields, grain supplies dwindled, and livestock perished. With too many mouths to feed, famine swept through towns and villages. Starvation claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, while disease spread among the weakened. For the first time in centuries, Europe's population declined. Barely a generation later, an even deadlier scourge arrived, the Black Death, 1347 to 1351. Carried by fleas on rats, traveling along trade routes, the plague erupted in the Mediterranean and swept rapidly across the continent. In just 4 years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Entire villages vanished, cities lost half of their inhabitants, and fields went untended. Fear and despair gripped society. Some sought repentance through prayer and penance. Others turned to violence, blaming minorities such as Jews for the catastrophe. The psychological impact was immense. Death became a constant presence, haunting art, literature, and religion. Images of skeletons, the dance of death, and grim sermons reminded survivors of life's fragility. Trust in institutions faltered. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the Church, with all its power, failed to protect the faithful?
Even as plague ravaged Europe, political and military turmoil deepened the crisis. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France, dragged on for generations. This struggle for territory and crowns devastated the French countryside, introduced new weapons such as the longbow and cannon, and undermined the chivalric ideals of knighthood. Famous figures like Joan of Arc emerged from this conflict, inspiring resistance but also symbolizing the war's religious and national fervor. Other troubles compounded the misery. The papacy itself fell into disarray during the Avignon Papacy, 1309 to 1377, when popes resided in France rather than Rome, raising doubts about their independence.
Soon after came the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417, when rival popes claimed authority, dividing Christendom. To ordinary believers, the Church seemed less a shepherd of souls and more a battlefield of politics. Together, famine, plague, war, and spiritual division shattered the confidence of medieval society. The world that had seemed so stable in 1300 was collapsing. Yet out of this suffering came change. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants new bargaining power, leading to peasant revolts and the gradual erosion of serfdom. Monarchies emerged stronger, consolidating power as feudal bonds weakened. Intellectuals began questioning old certainties, laying the groundwork for new ways of thinking. The 14th century was a time of death and destruction, but it also marked the end of the medieval order and the beginning of something new. Ahead lay the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the dawn of modern Europe. The story of medieval Europe is not a tale of darkness alone, nor of unbroken progress. It is the story of a civilization that rose from the ruins of Rome, endured centuries of struggle, and slowly transformed itself into a dynamic, outward-looking world. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Europe began to recover from the cataclysm of plague, famine, and prolonged warfare. Though population numbers were lower than a century earlier, the surviving population enjoyed new opportunities. Land was abundant, wages rose, and peasants gained freedoms previously unimaginable. Urban centers recovered quickly, benefiting from increased trade, artisanal production, and the expansion of markets. Meanwhile, warfare was transforming. Gunpowder, introduced from Asia, revolutionized military technology. Cannons could breach the strongest walls, while firearms gave infantry new prominence over heavily armored knights. Castles, once nearly impregnable, were increasingly obsolete. Lords adapted, hiring professional soldiers or serving emerging kings rather than relying solely on traditional feudal levies. Monarchs seized the opportunity to consolidate power. In France, the monarchy gradually reclaimed authority from the feudal aristocracy after the 100 Years' War, creating a more centralized state. In England, the War of the Roses would later reshape the monarchy and aristocratic structure, setting the stage for Tudor England. Spain unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the Reconquista and establishing a strong, centralized kingdom. Even Italy, though fragmented, developed powerful city-states with mercenary armies, financial innovations, and diplomacy that rivaled older empires. The Church remained powerful but faced challenges. Criticism of clerical wealth, corruption, and political entanglements grew. Movements for reform, precursors to the Reformation, began to emerge. Yet its influence on education, law, and daily life continued to shape European society.